There in Apos the royal family, the public is meant to see polished, controlled, and always projecting unity. And then there in Apos the version that exists behind closed doors, where power is negotiated quietly, and documents can carry more weight than any public statement. Prince Edward spent almost his entire public life on the visible side of that divide, steady, loyal, and deliberately far from controversy. So when reports began suggesting he had pushed back against a direction set by King Charles himself, people who watched this family closely understood immediately that this was not a small disagreement. This is what, and Apos being alleged, what may have happened, why it matters, and what it could signal about the monarchy in Apos' next chapter. Prince Edward suddenly matters to understand why Edward and Apos' shift caught people off guard. You have to appreciate how carefully he had built his public identity, never the controversial one, never the one forcing palace communications teams into damage control. Always the quietly loyal figure who seemed genuinely unbothered by the absence of a spotlight. That image is exactly what made the change noticeable. Sources familiar with palace dynamics began remarking on what could only be described as an intentional visibility. Appearances that felt purposeful rather than routine, a presence that suggested something internal had shifted. Background characters Don and Apos moved forward without a reason, and whatever had moved Edward, it was clearly significant enough to override years of carefully maintained restraint. But the shift in behavior was only the surface. Beneath it, something structural had reportedly been building for months. The pattern of exclusion, what reportedly began to concern Edward, was not a single incident, but an accumulation, and in an institution as deliberate as the British monarchy. Accumulations are rarely accidental. Sources close to palace operations suggest he had begun finding himself outside briefings and conversations he would previously have been included in as a matter of course. Decisions were being made, directions were being set, and the information reaching him felt incomplete in ways that were difficult to attribute to simple oversight. Staff exchanges that quieted when he entered rooms, references to discussions he hadn't and Apos been part of these things, added up into something that Edward reportedly concluded was not carelessness. It was deliberate. The distinction matters enormously because carelessness can be addressed with a conversation. A deliberate pattern requires something else entirely. And that, and Apos, where things start to look like more than an internal administrative shuffle. The document nobody was supposed to mention at the center of this story sits a document the kind institutions produce when planning significant internal change and would prefer that planning to remain quiet for as long as possible. Reports describe it in terms consistent with a long-term restructuring blueprint, something outlining how the working monarchy intended to reorganize itself going forward, which roles would be consolidated, which family branches would retain active public functions, and which would gradually transition towards something far more limited. On a purely administrative level, this kind of planning is not unusual. But the practical implications of a document like this are anything but abstract. It determines whose branch of the family remains relevant and whose quietly fades. The reason it was allegedly kept close, sources suggest, was the predictability of the resistance it would generate if it circulated too broadly, too soon. But documents rarely stay quiet forever. And the document itself is only half the story. What it implied for one specific family line is the real trigger. Why Edward took it personally when Edward reportedly became aware of what the document implied, what sources describe was not professional frustration. It was something more personal and arguably more powerful. The concern was never primarily about his own position within the working structure. It was about his children, about whether the next generation of his family line would have any meaningful role to play in the institution they had been raised to serve, or whether those doors would quietly close before they ever had a real chance to open. Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, and Edward and Apos' wife had reportedly noticed the change in him long before any of this became externally visible. The late nights, the restlessness, a preoccupation that sat just beneath the surface of his public composure. The feeling driving it, reportedly, was something close to erasure. Not sudden or loud, but gradual and deliberate, a slow rewriting of who mattered. And at some point, sources suggest, Edward decided he was not going to absorb that quietly any longer. Sophie and Anne, the quiet alarms in this family, the people who say the least often communicate the most through what surrounds their silence. Princess Anne, Edward and Apos' older sister, and one of the most protocol-driven figures in the royal structure, was said to be quietly present around him in a way that read as something more than coincidental. Neither Sophie nor Anne makes open declarations about internal disagreements. That is simply not how either operates. But their positioning during this period, sources suggest, was deliberate enough to be read clearly by those paying attention. He was not navigating this alone, and the people standing quietly beside him were not figures whose judgment anyone in the palace would easily dismiss, because once this stopped being a private concern, it was never going to stay contained. The confrontation seen there is an unspoken rule that governs almost every formal interaction within the royal family. You do not interrupt the monarch, and you do not publicly reframe a conversation he is leading. The choreography of these meetings exists for a reason, and breaking it carries a weight that most people in that environment are deeply conditioned to avoid. The room was formal, the kind of setting where silence between sentences carries its own pressure. Charles had been framing the restructuring ahead in the language of necessary modernization, a leaner monarchy built for contemporary demands. For a moment, it seemed the conversation would proceed as it always had, controlled, orderly, predictable. Then Edward spoke. "This was not modernization," he reportedly said. "This was dismantling." Eyes in the room, sources suggest, stayed carefully still. Charles held his position that the institution required difficult choices to survive. Edward, in a pause response, reportedly, was quiet but clear. Difficult choices and erasure are not the same thing. He had said what he came to say, and in that environment, saying it at all was the statement. But the leak is where this stops being private. The leak and the PR war in the royal world. Controlling the narrative after a rupture is often more consequential than the rupture itself. Once details of the exchange and the underlying document speculation began moving beyond palace walls, the media response was immediate. Coverage was sharp, fast, and deeply divided, some framing Edward as a loyalist finally pushed past his limit, others suggesting he had acted on incomplete information. The official palace response was carefully vague, enough language to suggest stability without confirming or denying anything of real substance. The counter-narrative positioning Edward as misinformed briefly threatened to define the story, but then something shifted. The same qualities that had made Edward easy to overlook for years, his visible lack of personal ambition, his long record of service without drama, worked powerfully in his favor. People believed him almost instinctively because he had never appeared to want anything for himself. And that instinct, once it took hold in the public conversation, proved very difficult for any palace statement to dislodge. The Queen in a pause letter angle. This is the part of the story that moves it from institutional politics into something that feels almost like a trial over legacy. There are persistent rumors, unconfirmed and treated with appropriate caution, that Queen Elizabeth left behind some form of private correspondence in her final period, a guidance of sorts, touching on how she envisioned the family continuing to function as a cohesive unit. No such letter has been made public, and its existence remains firmly in the realm of speculation. But the significance of the rumor is the contrast it frames between a monarchy built on the principle of family unity and one being restructured around operational consolidation. Edward's, sources suggest, has drawn on this contrast not as a claim to power, but as a moral argument. Not "and quot want more influence and quot," but rather "and quot these is not what she built this family to become." And quot as a positioning, it is difficult to argue against publicly, which is likely part of why it has proven so resonant with the people watching. The mandate, the final move, some reporting suggests that at a certain point, the internal resistance stopped being engaged with and was instead met with official action designed to close the debate. Reassignments and adjustments to working roles were allegedly moved forward, changes that effectively reduced the scope of active public duties for certain family members, regardless of the objections that had been raised internally. The message embedded in those moves, intentional or not, was straightforward. The direction had been determined, and the window for discussion had closed. Public reaction to the emerging outlines of what was happening was notably sharp. Op-eds appeared, petitions circulated, and a visible wave of sentiment pushed back against what many perceived as a handling of the situation that prioritized institutional efficiency over basic decency within a family. That kind of sustained public reaction is not something any modern monarchy can afford to absorb indefinitely without some form of response. Where William stands the turning point, everything else in this story carries a kind of narrative clarity: the grievance, the confrontation, the leak, the public response. What does not resolve cleanly is the position of the one person whose alignment will ultimately determine how this chapter gets written. Prince William, heir to the throne, occupies a position that is almost impossibly difficult to navigate in a moment like this. Loyal to his father, conscious of the institutional pressures Charles is managing, and simultaneously aware that the structural choices being made now will define the monarchy he eventually inherits. Reports of quiet conversations and private meetings have circulated, along with suggestions that some positions may be softening in response to sustained pressure. Nothing concrete has been confirmed, but the thing most observers keep returning to is not what William has said, it is what he has not said. His silence, extended and deliberate, remains the loudest and most consequential element of this entire situation. When it ends, the direction it falls will tell us nearly everything about what the monarchy in a post-next phase actually looks like. What this means: monarchies are not ultimately sustained by the elegance of their ceremonies or the weight of their traditions. They are sustained by public trust, and public trust is built on something surprisingly difficult to manufacture: the genuine sense that the people inside the institution believe in something larger than their own position within it. What this story reveals, whatever its final resolution turns out to be, is a tension that sits at the heart of every institution that has survived long enough to face the question of its own future. How do you modernize without losing the thing that made people believe in you? How do you streamline without making the people inside feel quietly erased? Edward did not rage publicly. He did not leak documents or give explosive interviews designed to cause maximum damage. He stood up, in a room where standing up carries real cost, and said what he believed needed to be said. Whether that changes anything in a lasting way remains to be seen. But the fact that this particular man, with this particular history of quiet loyalty, reached a point where silence was no longer something he was willing to offer, that alone tells you this was never a minor disagreement. It was a line being drawn.